Hello to Stora Hässerungas Lake. We are now in the municipality of Mölndal, not far from Gothenburg, and we are going to have lecture H651 today, and we are going to talk about etymology. And I'd say that etymology is a very important concept when it comes to understand what is knowledge. What does it consist of? And I'd say there are rather two aspects that are very important. One is, how did it develop? It developed in time. All knowledge develop in time. That's where they get their substance from. They take time, they change time, and they are in a way time. Information is time. And the other aspect is, how do you do knowledge? Because knowledge is an act. It always has been an act and will always be an act. You do something. Excuse me. It's the fireplace. The second aspect is practicality. How do you perform knowledge? I'd say those factors disappeared thanks to, in view of the early lectures we mentioned, the transcendentalism, the progressing tendency to make everything sky high, non-existent, non-real, non-embodied, not of this world. So what does it end in? Well, when it comes to meaning in language, we are stranded. Instead of having the substance of the words, the body of the words, the materiality, the temporality of the words, we just have opposition, contradiction. I think there's been a change in how words take meaning today than it used to be. Today they are formed by contradictions, oppositions, polarities, a bit like subject and object. One example is Sir Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous faces when it comes to Western philosophy. He changed his mind no less than 12 times when it comes to philosophy. But he is not an exception. The normal thing when it comes to knowledge is constantly change your mind. It is a proof that knowledge, words are no longer based on knowledge. It's just contradictions. In my own subject, I started 30 years ago, linguistic. There have been a complete change 3 times now, already in 30 years. It started out from some sort of realistic perspective, influenced by analytical philosophy, and then it all of a sudden very quickly changed into computer derived knowledge. We thought that language was some sort of computer language, and then for the third time it changed again. It's 3 changes, and those are fundamental, and that means that you change your way of talking, you change your way of reasoning, everything changed, and all the old knowledge became incommensurable. That meaning it doesn't have any sense any longer. The old view doesn't hold. There's a waste of space having that knowledge. And this is the modern tendency. We change constantly. And I even heard professors saying to me when I got the subject, this is very interesting, I think it's true, but you can already learn to criticize it because it's going to change in 10 years. Hey, what sort of knowledge is that? Well, it certainly not is the knowledge as it used to be, not at all. It has been a complete change of knowledge. and the change is tremendous. One of the guys pointing that out is somebody I met in lectures early on by happenstance, I would say. I was studying English my first term at the university, and there was this doctor in language coming from the United States, and he had very, very complicated lecture where he criticized and took up a person named Harold Bloom. And Harold Bloom is the famous author of the even more famous book, or infamous book, The Closing of the American Mind. It came out in 1987, and it criticized the openness of relativism in academia and in society in general. And what he means by closing, it is the fact we are abandoning all the canonical knowledge we have. We used to have a canon for knowledge. Literature, for instance, it was the works of Shakespeare. In music, it was the great composers. In art, it was the great artists, and so on. It's an eradication of knowledge. And he supports that both in argument and in good research. How is the condition of knowledge, he asks. What do people know today? Is that knowledge, or is it purely based on the words, the superficial likeness of knowledge, how it used to be? And nowadays people are entering the educational facilities with a clean slate. They no longer have a good beginning. Knowledge is no longer prevalent in society. It has become something quite rare. And one of the faults, he says, is the disappearance of the great books. They have been devalued as a source of wisdom. But more importantly, that our students have lost the practice and taste of reading. Because of this, students are unable to derive their beliefs from evidence, from central texts, or any print source at all. Bloom contends that without an understanding of important older texts such as Plato's Republic, Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, modern students lack any reference point with which they can critically think about or address current events. Students are instead left with vague and abstract ideas of God, good and evil. And what are they? They are contradictions. So what he means, in a sense, is everything is today based on contradictions. That I oppose that, or I argue against that, or even worse, I have the truth, whereas that is not the truth. And that is knowledge by arguing. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't go back to knowledge, because knowledge cannot be made in an instant. Knowledge is not something you produce here and now by opposing something or being positive towards something. That's a parody of knowledge. And he clearly shows, and the evidence is devastating. Knowledge has gone down in the American universities with at least 80%, when people are checked what they know of the great works, the knowledge is almost down to zero. And it has a reason. When you base everything in contradictions, you lose the substance and you lose the ability to remember what is good, because that can only be told from history. History and time tells its evidence. And I would say that Harold Bloom is not the only one. He is joined by Heidegger, and in this excellent article by Matthew King you can read about Heidegger's etymological method, and in that he shows that to know the meaning of important concepts and even the words themselves, you need to go back. Otherwise, it will be very similar to making an archaeological investigations without doing any digging. It's exactly the same. Language is not a special case. We don't get meaning from free. Anyone who says that meaning just comes to them are ignorant. And that's a complete ignorance. It doesn't get any worse. No one can know the meaning of any word without practicing it and without knowing its history. It's impossible. So what Heidegger is actually pointing to is exactly the same thing as Harold Bloom did much later. It's the thinning out of knowledge, and actually the aggressiveness towards knowledge. There is a distaste for knowledge today. Knowledge has been something old-fashioned. Now you just go with the flow. You change your view every other year, 10 years, 5 years, and you said, no, the fashion is over. Let's now learn something else. But what they actually are, they're just parrots, imitating fine words that authority told them. And what Heidegger is pointing to is that we've been and become authoritarian. Before, knowledge used to be the base of your safety, your balance, and also your power to be a free person, a liberated person. Because without knowledge, you cannot be liberated, you cannot be emancipated. You are constantly a slave to das Man in a bad way. Because it can be a good way. The good way of being together with das Man is that you are understanding das Man, but you're not subservient to it. But the bad way is also what Maslow calls the authoritarian person. The person who imitates what the authority says to him. And this is what happens today. In the end, oppositions and polarities are constructions by power, and it makes you powerless to accept them, because you are going to be a victim of this constant change, and this change is actually progressing. We are killing knowledge off more and more by constantly changing more and more often. And one thing that I reacted to is the invention of new words constantly. Words that doesn't have any base in a practice or historically, and those words are the fad words. When I studied, one fad word was context or diskurs, Swedish words, but people were using them constantly. And they looked like silly monkeys imitating some pretense of knowledge, laughable people really. But what they were acting out were as subservient to authority, to the institution and to influential people. we have become subservient, less human. And what Heidegger is pointing to is that we should go back to the source and find ourselves in history. Without doing that, we won't understand anything. And another good example is recently the change in religion, for instance. A good friend of ours, Kjell Burman, he kept the banner high. He never changed anything. And I think that one of the reasons for that, because he intuitively understood, even if the new thing might sound good, it's not based on history. Therefore, it's weaker. It's the diluted form of religion. It's not the same stuff it's made of, because it has a history. It has things that it can teach us. But whereas the new thing is just an invention from argument. Somebody put up an argument. Somebody made a piece of logic and sort of created knowledge in this now. It's a synthetic knowledge. And it doesn't have any resemblance to pure knowledge, because this knowledge cannot lead us to a good point. Actually, it's bound to destroy us, because the more we follow this constantly changing direction, if you stand still, please, the more we move with our minds, with our knowledge, the less directed we are. And what are modern man? It's a person that's completely undirected. He or she doesn't have a purpose in life anymore. He can't see that. And welcome to the postmodern world. A world with despair, lack of leading, lack of leadership, lack of persistence. You give up one thing and you change it to another thing. Jumping between the oppositions. Because the opposite of something is the same thing always. To believe in that the opposition of something could be something better is wrong. Let me cite Paul Feyerabend. None of the scientific breakthroughs are true in any sense. They are something much more. They are workable. They are pieces of knowledge. Scientists are not looking for truth. They are looking for something much more substantial. Something that actually gives you an insight into the world. And still, science is such a small area of our knowledge base. In all the other areas, we don't follow that maxim. We just use words like they come about for us, and we rearrange them, and we try to fondle and play with oppositions and all things, and we make up new things instantly. Knowledge here and now, that only sounds like knowledge. It's like instant food. It's like those products you buy in the freezer dish, the freezers in the supermarket. You put them in the microwave and you get instantaneous food. But it doesn't have sustenance. It doesn't provide nutrients to you. It doesn't provide food for thoughts, as you can say, or food for the stomach, nothing. And this is the new knowledge. And of course, Harry Bloom points out there are actually advantages. We can get more people into education because it's so much simpler. Is it a gain or is it a loss? I don't know. You be the judge. But there's still a diluting going on. We made it much simpler. It's so easy to parroting words and not have the knowledge. That makes that more people can have titles. I think we have 3 times the amount of professors in Sweden since 40 years ago. And everybody becomes professors, and everybody becomes I don't know what. Is that good or bad? I don't know. But there is a need for knowledge in people. Knowledge always served a purpose for human beings, because it's knowledge that leads us and is going to make our decisions wise. And all these there's another thing. There's a fragmentization of knowledge as well, and I think that's part and parcel of the problem. You say this is this area and this is that area, and we're getting more and more areas all the time. This is the splitting. This is the opposition power. I say this area is different from that one because of contradiction. You find differences, and then you make up new things, and you get further and further away from the core. You are lacking all intimacy with creation, with existence, with the real world here. So we are actually going outside of science, even further from knowledge. And I think that's one of the reasons that Heidegger is pinpointing the importance of genuine language. And I always thought that to realize and to thoroughly understand the development I've been mentioning in the lectures past here in antiquity in Greece, I think it could be extremely helpful to learn Greek, to learn the language and see what remnants, because I think it still have to be etymological differences in the Greek way of thinking and doing things that are very, very important telling points for how this development happened once upon a time, and that there are actually traits, you say, like hidden traits that can be uncovered in the language, in the way of doing things, in their life world, all going all the way back from antiquity. So you can actually do a sort of etymology in the whole nation. But that's bound to be those traits. They cannot disappear. And that's typical of the modern thinking. We always live in the now. So we forget the history. It's long way past. And therefore we can't understand the now, because we are formed by time. Otherwise it's just ridiculous. Then it would be like some sort of transcendental forming, and words, as actually one of my professors had the idea that the transcendental tendency, he called it the spirit of meaning, sort of a ghost that gave the words meaning from underneath, and he showed it with the hands. Came in and took the word and gave it meaning. I think that was a really, really positive description of that. His meaning just came from opposition, contradictions. It doesn't make meaning, just as putting 2 sticks of wood will make a house. It needs planning, it needs to be informed by knowledge, and above all, it needs a plan. And Heidegger makes a very interesting point here with the German language. He's that is less affected of this turnabout tendency than English. English had suffered a huge invasion in 1066, I think, with the Normans. And that disrupted the English society and made it lacking the foundation for a clear language. I'm not too sure about that, but it's still a very interesting point. It goes to show history and their changes are the most important thing. History is not just a subject in a book somewhere hidden away in a library. History is what's forming us. And it was therefore Heidegger also had these 2 different words, not oppositions, but 2 different words. He had Geschichte and he had history. And Geschichte, that was the development that happened in time. And that's the real development. Whereas history was the told story about that. And those are completely different. They don't really have anything to do with each other. And can, of course, sometimes coincide to very important aspects, but they are essentially different. Geschichte is something we won't know to the fullest. We will only know a fraction. but what we can find is true. And the Geschichte is another way of showing why etymology is so incredibly important. And to disregard that is to disregard all sorts of knowledge whatsoever. There can't be any knowledge without etymology. That's a dead project. Then you just have a very, very narrow language game, as Heidegger would, Wittgenstein would have termed it. A language game that take the professor and the students and they play it out inside the school hall, and it doesn't go outside that. It's a game, and it produces, and it has a similarity with a proper language game, but it doesn't take any of its substance from the proper language game. It's a separated, in a way separated, and it's completely shallow as well. Well, let me conclude here. This is a great step for etymology, and it's disappointing when I read in the start of the article that this is one of the few ones that actually pointed out the importance of etymology. I think etymology, that's the flesh of the language and of thinking, however it goes and wherever it goes. And therefore I end here and I say thank you very much, and maybe we should take a look at panoramic of the fire going out slowly.